Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. John Valadez is a Peabody Award-winning filmmaker with 2 Emmy nominations. He has written and directed a dozen nationally broadcast documentary films for PBS and CNN over the past 18 years. Last year, 2 of his films, War and Peace, about Latinos in World War II, and Prejudice and Pride, about the Chicano movement, aired on the landmark PBS documentary series, Latino Americans. John, welcome to Fronteras.
Thank you for having me.
Here's the thing. You have spent the last 10 years working on a project searching for the remains of Joaquin Murrieta. Why don't we start our conversation by learning about Joaquin Murrieta and why you were inspired to spend the last 10 years searching for the remains?
Well, look, Joaquin Murrieta was a young Mexican kid who came to California during the California Gold Rush, back 1849, 1850, right in there. And what happened was there was a lot of racial and ethnic violence that was taking place as Mexicans and Anglos began to clash in the West. And Mexicans were driven out of the gold fields, and there was this one guy, Joaquin Murrieta, whose gold mining claim was purportedly jumped by Anglos, whose wife was raped and murdered. And he then goes on a trail of revenge and murder, against the Anglo oppressors, right? And eventually the governor of California, John Bigler, dispatches a group of cutthroats, professional bounty hunters called the California Rangers, to hunt down this Joaquin Murrieta. And they return to Sacramento about a month later with a severed human head in a jar. And they collect their reward money, and then they begin to tour throughout California to hotels, brothels, saloons, displaying the head and charging people $1 to see their trophy. And of course, this instills fear in the Mexican community, and the gold fields empty of Mexicans, and they begin to form little communities all across California, what are today the Mexican-American barrios, East LA, the Mission District, Santa Barbara. That's how those communities formed. So Joaquin Murrieta is a really fascinating character in American history, and to think that a Mexican was decapitated and his head displayed throughout the West on the orders of the governor of the state of California.
It's like a scene out of Pirates, giving or showing an example of what could happen to you if you cross the authorities.
Right. Well, it's out of Pirates. It's like a scene out of ISIS, right?
Yes,
except
exactly.
it's the U.S. government cutting off heads. Now the problem, not the problem, but what makes the story even more interesting is that there was no mugshot of Joaquin Murrieta. This was pre-photography. Nobody knew what he looked like. Nobody knew if these crimes were actually even committed by him, right? It was in the gold fields, and so who knows? Maybe it was Anglos pretending to be Mexicans. Maybe it was other Mexicans. Maybe, we don't even really know.
Some urban legend that began and started to spread among some of these camps, and went up the ladder to the governor, who decided, let's find somebody that's an easy target for us.
Right, so it may have been just an unlucky Mexican who was murdered for the reward. Now, fast forward 163 years later, and I hear about a guy in California, in the suburbs of Northern California, who has the purported head of Joaquin Murrieta in a jar after all these years. So I go out to California, I meet this guy, and he tells me, oh, I don't have the head anymore, I got rid of it, I buried it. And I didn't believe him, and so I, come on, let me see it. I cajoled, I pleaded, I offered him money, anything I could think of, and no avail. And so I went home empty-handed. I wasn't able to see the head. And then years later, we kind of kept in touch. I kept bugging him, and years later, I finally am able to get a hold of the purported head of Joaquin Murrieta. And so what the film is about, it's about me. I live in New York, and now that I have this severed head of this legendary Mexican outlaw or freedom fighter, depending on your perspective, what am I going to do? So I decide, well, I'm going to drive across country from New York back to California. I'm going to bury him at Arroyo Cantua in California, the place where he was purportedly murdered back in 1853. And along the way, I learn about Joaquin Murrieta, and I learn about the troubled history of Anglos and Mexicans in the West, and I learn about the lynching of Mexican Americans in the West. 871 documented lynchings of Mexican Americans in 13 Western states. In proportion to their numbers, Mexicans were lynched in the West as often as African Americans were lynched in the South. A painful, terrible, hidden history that has never been addressed or discussed, and yet has important implications for the present, I would argue.
Well, as you talk about hidden history, you also mentioned, two sides of a story. I mean, is he a hero? Is he a villain? One side paints him as a villain, another side paints him as somebody that is distraught by the murder of his wife, that goes out for revenge. It almost seems like a romantic story.
Well, I think what makes a story interesting is that it's complicated and it's nuanced. I mean, I almost think of Joaquin Murrieta as a historical intercultural Rorschach test. An ink blot, and whoever looks at the ink blot sees kind of what they want to see. It's a reflection of the viewer rather than a reflection of the reality of the past. And so much of history is that way. It's how we see the perspective from which we view the event. And was Joaquin a hero? I don't know. Was he a murderer? I don't know. Was he a good man made monstrous by circumstance? Mm-hmm. I don't know. But I think you can look at it different ways. And I don't necessarily come to any conclusions.
Okay.
Because I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say that I'm the wellspring of knowledge here. I'm an inquirer. I don't necessarily have the answers, but I think I pose enough questions that, the viewer can kind of figure out what they think. And different viewers may come to different conclusions, and I think that's fair.
Let's talk about the lynchings. When I read about that in your bio and, researched it, it's something that I have never grown up hearing about this. And, in Texas school books and, or anywhere in New Mexico, that such incidents occurred at such an alarming rate. What was the purpose of these lynchings? What were these people being accused of?
Well, I think that's a complicated question. On one level, I think some people would argue, well, people were lynched because they committed crimes. It was a lawless time, and it was rough frontier justice. Okay, that's been one traditional explanation. However, why does it seem to fall along racial lines? Mm-hmm. Why is it white people lynching Mexicans? If it was just criminality and rough justice, there would be an equal number of Mexicans lynching white people. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't. It's only one way. And so part of what the film is about, it's about the exploration of myth and legend in American history. There's a big myth in the state of Texas and in the country that there were these courageous men who fought and died for freedom and liberty at this old mission called the Alamo. Well, that's a fantasy. Jim Bowie, who met his demise there, was a slave trader. He and his brothers prior to the Alamo, would go down to Galveston, which was Mexican territory, illegally buy slaves for $1 a pound, like any other commodity by the pound, buy them for $1 a pound, smuggle them then illegally into Louisiana and sell them at $5 a pound. And that's how they made their fortune. These guys were, cutthroats, many of them on the run from the law, and the purpose of them coming from the south to Texas, Tejas, Mexican territory, was basically to establish slavery and to get cheap or free Mexican land so that they could build big plantations just like they had in the south. It was about the theft of human flesh, slavery, and it was about the theft of Mexican land. That is the truth. That's what happened. And of course, if you're going to take someone's land, well, you have to get them out of the way. Hence, quite often lynching. And we know that there were millions and millions, I think 23 million acres of land was owned by Mexican Americans in Texas. Within a generation, nearly all of it was lost, most of it through fraud and violence. It was a huge, theft of Mexican Americans' resources, their wealth, that basically landed them at the bottom of the economic chain in America for generations.
In your films, you like to tell stories of Latino Americans in our country. And again, as you're telling me some of these stories, you paint the story of Jim Bowie and how he's romanticized, in the state of Texas. And some of these Latino Americanos and Mexican Americans, they offer rich history to not only California, but to Texas, all of these states. And their histories are almost gone, disappeared. What, as a filmmaker, do you hope to accomplish by sharing these stories?
Well, a couple of things. Number one is no racial or ethnic group has a monopoly on great stories about history and the making of this country. And I think Mexican American history is a beautiful and extraordinary and dramatic untapped realm. So that's, for a storyteller, that's pretty fertile territory, I have to say. But we're also in a time of rapidly changing demographics. The country is changing. By 2050, we're going to be a majority-minority nation. By sometime during the 21st century after that, we're going to be a Latino country. Mm-hmm. So what we need to do is we need to look at the story of America and begin to see that narrative as inclusive of all these different peoples. It's the only way that we're going to be able to span divides of difference and find new connections for positive change and understanding so that we can all move forward as Americans to a more prosperous, more equitable, more fair, more free, inclusive future. So I think this is important work. It's important work.
Speaking of your work, here's what I find very interesting about it: the diversity in your subject matter. You really touch upon the different ideas. How do you go about tackling an issue and deciding this is the issue I want to talk about? Because, it's got to be of interest to you first and foremost, right?
Yeah. Well, with Joaquin Murrieta, it's a kind of a departure for me because on some level it's a very personal film, right? I'm taking this head. It's a personal journey that I'm going. It's a road trip film, right, across the country. But I'm also personally invested. As you see in the film, when I was growing up in Seattle, I had a nickname. I was called Spick. I was actually called Spick. I was called Wetback and Beaner, but Spick for some reason
Stuck.
was the moniker that stuck. Spick stuck, right? And I, you know, and I guess for much of my life I've wondered, why that word? Why did that happen? I mean, because, you know, when you're a kid, I'm just John. You know, right? But it made me realize that prior to me entering this story of America, there was a whole, you know, I'm entering it mid-story. There were all these things that happened before me. That's where Spick came from. And I felt on some level that part of telling the story of Joaquin Murrieta was a way to tell the story of this terrible crucible of racial violence that has been central to the Mexican Anglo experience. And by understanding that, you really understand the origins of the word spick and the exclusion and marginalization and dehumanization that comes with it. And so for me, it was a way of unraveling that mystery of racial unease, distrust, anxiety, that I still see going on all around us today. Now, you don't hear spick so much. It's not the word du jour, but you hear words like illegal, right, which take, you know, a human being with a complex social and emotional and familial life with their own dreams and ambitions, and you reduce them to a singularity that criminalizes them when they're a complex human being. Right? Or I've heard words like anchor baby. I don't know if you've heard this.
Oh,
yeah.
Again, growing up in Texas, you know, and over the last several years, you know, hearing it kind of like in the underground.
Yeah.
And then hearing politicians kind of like making it okay to use those words. And it's like, kind of offensive when I first heard I knew it was offensive when I was hearing it, you know, among people I knew who would talk about it. But then to hear politicians legitimize it really struck me as very odd.
Well, more than odd. I mean, I'll just come out and say it. It's racist.
Yeah, offensive.
It's racist. And you know, and it's one thing to hear kind of a lunatic like Donald Trump use the phrase. But he's a fellow New Yorker, so I think we can rib each other in that way. But, you know, to hear Jeb Bush use that phrase that takes people who are young American citizens and tries to, delegitimize them and dehumanize them is just really, and really refers to brown children. Is really
of
gross.
Which he has.
Well,
you know.
One could make the argument that Jeb Bush has an anchor wife. You know, and I wonder how he would respond to that. I mean, would it be justified for him to be offended if someone said that he had an anchor wife when he's using that same term about other people's children? And to me, that's not presidential leadership. That's disgusting, and it's gross, and it's bigoted, and it's the politics of hate. And it's just, I'm frankly appalled, I have to say.
What is the story that Latino Americans can tell across this country to, you know, form a storyline that is positive, you know, and how can we, I know you as a filmmaker are working towards it, but, you know, what can young filmmakers do? What can young photographers do, storytellers? You know, how can we guide them into such a direction that allows for them to tell a positive story of the culture and community?
Yeah. Well, here's the truth. The truth is that Mexican Americans are like every other American. The same hopes and dreams, the same longings, the same fears, the same sense of patriotism when we see the flag wave upon the mast. You know, we're people like every other American group. And so we lead the same complex lives, we have the same contradictions, we have the same foibles, we have we're people. And I guess I try to avoid terms like positive or negative, but we're like everybody else. And so to tell a great story about Mexican Americans is really to tell a great story about the human condition. And that's something that we all have in common. And I think that's the hope, is that we begin to see each other as human beings, as fellow Americans, as part of the great future of this country. And it's a beautiful narrative of freedom and democracy. All of those things are actually true, and Mexican Americans are actually a really important part of that narrative, if we just take the time to listen.
I think here at New Mexico State University, with its CMI program, the different audiovisual programs, and I see the enrollment of Latinos increase, and I see, again, it's an opportunity for them to look and dig. And actually, you don't even have to dig very deep, to find stories of Mexican Americans. I mean, the stories are there, but again, it's a matter of telling the stories so that people can start embracing the culture as just that, a culture, and not a moniker for politicians to make fun of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Mexican Americans have always known that we're patriotic, and that we love this country, and that we have complex lives. I think about, we did for the Latino American series, I did a film about World War II, and 500,000 Latinos fought in World War II. Mexican Americans were the most highly decorated of any ethnic group in the entire war. More medals of honor, silver stars on down the line than any other ethnic group. And, we've always known that. I guess the challenge is to make sure that everybody else knows who we are. Because I think once they hear these stories, I think the stories are so exciting, they're so engaging, they're so honest, and they say so much about the American experience that they're just compelling. So on the one hand, I think there's a lot of exciting work to be done, and that just really gets me going. I mean, there's so much fertile territory to explore. It's really tremendous.
When I think of you as a filmmaker. But with your latest film, try to imagine you traveling through the state of California with a jar, carrying a jar. I mean, how challenging was that? I mean, did people approach you? Did you have it covered? And, again, it's the severed head of somebody that's over 150 years old, if I'm not mistaken, that you're traveling with, and you have a purpose for it.
Yeah, and it's weird. I mean, I have to say, it is weird. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the head. I mean, it's a crazy adventure. And in the film, I make some stops. I come down to Texas, since we're in Texas, and I stop in Goliad. A friend of mine who's a folk historian out of Houston takes me to Goliad, and in Goliad is the most famous tree in all of Texas. It's the hanging tree in Goliad in front of the courthouse. No one knows how many Mexicans were lynched at that tree, but estimates are 70, 80, 90, 100. Nobody really knows. And, and what happened in Goliad wasn't unique. Every Texas town had a hanging tree. A lot of Mexicans lynched. And so, to have this head and to visit the hanging tree, I mean, honestly, it's like, on one level, it's a very depressing film to make. On the other hand, there's also a part of the film that's filled with, humor, a little bit of gallows humor, because I don't know, if you get too caught up in the hatred of the past, you can't have an optimism for the future. So I think there's something very healing about telling a painful story because we are not living that story right now. We're writing a new one for a new America. And in order to do that, in order to live a more prosperous, more inclusive future, part of the requirement is that you have to be honest and truthful about that painful past that we've all gone through together. And in acknowledging that past, then, we don't have to, no apologies. No one has to feel bad. We weren't there. Nobody did any of this stuff, right? But let's be honest about it, and knowing what the past held, let's figure out a way that we can build the bonds of fellowship and brotherhood and sisterhood so that we can build a more equitable future, so that we don't have to live in the shadow forever of the past and those dark times. So I think there's something wonderful about acknowledging the pain so that we can move forward, and then that's my intention, and I think I think the film really has that feel, that vibe. So I actually think it's a really quite enjoyable film to watch, despite how dark some of the subject matter is.
That's how I see it, of like literally going out hunting for what was considered a treasure back then, and finding it and giving it a home.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this film so interesting. What are you up to next? Do you know where you're going as far as projects?
Well, right now I'm on a tour, screening tour of colleges and universities. I have about 45 colleges and universities that I'm visiting this fall, right? And then next in the spring, right now I have maybe 15 or 20 more universities. And but we're working on a biography of Gloria Estefan.
Good.
And I'm also working on a film about the deportation of honorably discharged U.S. military veterans after they've completed their service in the United States Armed Forces.
Well, John Valadez, I want to thank you very much for coming in. The head of Joaquin Murrieta, your latest project. Thank you very much. For Fronteras, A Changing America, I'm Edmundo Resendez.